Catherine. When we came to New Bern for our first speech, my daughter Callie and I visited the Tryon Palace. It's the 1700s estate home of the Royal Governor William Tryon. One of the more curious things that we saw was a four-seater outhouse. They call it the necessary, and it was actually kind of pretty for an outhouse. I told my husband about it, and he said that his mother and father grew up with outhouses. Well, I decided on the spot I was going to interview my father-in-law and write a clever speech about the transition from outhouse to indoor plumbing. However, as soon as I got started with my research, I realized that I could not make light of a subject with such a history of disease and the shocking reality that there are people in North Carolina who still have outhouses. Throughout history, outhouses were certainly not like the pretty one at the Tryon Palace. LearnNC.com provides a document that was published in 1889 by the North Carolina State Board of Health. It was called the Sanitary Principles of the Construction of Privies. And this document described open surface privies, which were outhouses that were not fully enclosed. They were open from the seat down in the back. There was no container, so what was left behind was available for flies and birds and other animals, and also had the potential to filter down into water sources. The Board of Health document also provided requirements for more sanitary privies. It was in the early 1900s that a nasty creature called the hookworm turned the private business of privies into public concern. According to the North Carolina Museum of History, in 1909, the North Carolina Board of Health launched a massive public health campaign against the hookworm. This is a handbill that was distributed in Halifax County, and they were urging the residents there to go to the nearest dispensary to find screening, treatment, and education about the hookworm and sanitary practices that would help to prevent disease. And then in this 1911 poster, this was also distributed in that same time frame in 1911. It was published by the Board of Health, and it was basically to promote all around cleaner habits. And right here in the center, it actually has the outhouses along with the requirements. It says that it should be fly tight, and it should be over a pit and at least 100 yards away from the family well. Now, when I interviewed my father-in-law, I was glad that his outhouses met the requirements of the more sanitary privies. Now, Mr. Taylor grew up on a farm in rural Harnett County, North Carolina, and they had outhouses there until about 1956. They had pretty typical outhouses for the time. They would have one for men and one for women. They didn't call it an outhouse, they called it a john. And if it wasn't the john, it may have had a moon shape cut into the door. And if it had the moon shape in the door, they called it the moon house. And this is a picture of an outhouse that was quite similar to the one that the Taylors had. Now, on the Taylor farm, they would have a two-seater or a four-seater, and it depended on if it was for the family or the farm help. And they would have it tucked behind a barn that was both for privacy and for protection against strong winds. Inside the moon house, there would be a peg to hang a lantern, there would be a Sears Roebuck catalog, and a bucket of corn cobs. So the moon houses on the Taylor farm were well constructed of pine boards, and they had brick foundations, they were floored, they were placed over large pits that were about 4 feet deep. And they were placed several yards away from the home and gardens. And when I asked Mr. Taylor if anyone in his family had ever been sick because of contamination, he really didn't think so. Now, the Taylor family, they were not the only ones in the 1950s to have an outhouse. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, in 1950, there were over 660,000 homes without complete plumbing. This is a chart that shows the improvements between 1950 and the year 2000. Now, while I was surprised that there were over 660,000 homes without complete plumbing in 1950, I was shocked that less than 10 years ago, there were over 19,000 homes in North Carolina still without complete plumbing. So it'll be interesting to see when this year's census comes out what those numbers are going to be. In my mind, outhouses are a thing of the past, of centuries past, like the pretty outhouse at the Tryon Palace, or maybe even the outhouse on the Taylor's farm. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with Mr. Taylor about his experiences growing up on the farm and the private side of the Moon House. Through this speech, I took an unexpected look at an odd part of history and ended up thankful for the period in which we live. Thank you.